people waiting. I think we're going to get started. First, I'd like to acknowledge that Trinity Western University is located on the traditional ancestral unceded territories of the Stolo people. Good evening. I am Dr. Barb Astill, and I'm co-director of the Center of Equity and Global Engagement and the director of our MSN program at Trinity Western University. Alongside me is Dr. Holly Nelson. She's professor of English at Trinity Western University and co-director of the Center Studies Institute, and we will be your co-hosts for this event. The overall agenda for the evening, as you will see on the handout that many of you have in front of you, is where Holly will begin with briefly describing the purpose of the Gender Studies Institute, its vision, and how this topic that we're discussing tonight fits with their vision. I will provide context for our involvement with the cause of albinism and human rights, which will be followed by a presentation by our featured guest. Briefly, time for maybe one or two questions, followed by a panel presentation, and then we'll have a respondent to the presentations, followed by a second dialogue around two provocative questions that we'd like to pose for discussion, and have that amongst yourselves, and then bring it up with a Q&A with the group, and wrapping up around 8:30. To you, Holly.
The Gender Studies Institute, along with the Center for Equity and Global Engagement, Master of Science in Nursing, and Mothering and Albinism, would like to welcome you to the lecture, panel, and cafe on albinism, gender, and human rights, which brings together faculty and students working in a range of disciplines, all of whom are committed to giving voice to those who are often marginalized and silenced. At TWU, the Gender Studies Institute is focused on reconciliation, bringing people with different identities, orientations, experiences, and worldviews into conversation with each other in a way that brings about mutual understanding. However, reconciliation, as history has taught us, requires speaking the truth. And so our events work toward creating spaces for truths to be spoken into existence and received with respect and dignity. It is our honor to co-host an event tonight that considers the truth of the experience of people with albinism in a global context. And we very much look forward to hearing from all of the speakers, especially our feature speaker, on this important subject.
Thank you, Holly. Our involvement with the cause of albinism and human rights started approximately 4 years ago, November 2015, by the invitation of Ikponwosa Ero to support her United Nations mandate with her research. Dr. Cheryl Reimer-Kirkham's research program is on diversity, religion, ethnicity, gender, and health equity, and my research focuses on global health and health equity. Kind of a nice merging. Since then, we have been successful with several grants, most recently a project on mothering and albinism that Emma Strobel will speak to in our panel presentation. Important to our involvement in this research is to include a critical analysis of their underlying spiritual beliefs with our colleague, Elvis Ifmadon from Nigeria, who refers to what is called an African ontology, and the responses of faith communities in Africa, where religious affiliation is much higher than in Canada. With this context to our research, this is a perfect segue to introduce you to our featured guest speaker this evening, along with our other panel presenters. Ms. Ikponwosa Ero, the first UN independent expert on the enjoyment of human rights by persons with albinism, a designation given in 2015, whom Dr. Cheryl Reimer-Kirkham and myself have been working, as I mentioned, very closely these past 4 years. The vision of Ms. Ero's mandate is given by the cross-cutting principles of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, leaving no one behind, starting with the furthest behind first. Ms. Ero has over a decade of experience in the research, policy development, and practice of human rights concerning persons with albinism. She's advised organizations and governments around the world on human rights concerning persons with albinism. As the International Advocacy and Legal Officer for Under the Same Sun, an international organization with a focus on albinism, she's developed strategic initiatives involving regional and international human rights mechanisms, preparing guiding documents, and has oversaw the implementation of these recommendations made by the United Nations and other human rights organizations. I would ask now Kate to come to the podium for your presentation.
Hey, wow, good evening. Good evening. I'm so pleased to see all of you here, and it's not easy to come out on a cold, damp Vancouver evening to listen to an obscure topic like this. But it's very touching to see you all. Every support we can get on this issue is very important. So because I have only 20 minutes, I'm just going to jump right into my presentation today. I'm a little bit nervous. I think it's because my mother is here. She's like right there. My mama, my sister, my nephew. Yeah, I normally present not on home ground. I'm from Nigeria. I have albinism, but I've been in Canada for most of my life. And this is the first time that I'm presenting. This is the first time one of the first few times I've presented on home ground, so this is special. All right, so I would like to begin by dedicating my presentation to Dorothy. Dorothy was attacked just last November, and as you can see from the image, her left hand was cut off. When I saw this image at my office, like, it was very moving for me. I don't know, I have seen so many images, but the one of Dorothy really struck me. I suppose it reminded me of me, and not at the risk of sounding selfish, I felt like I was her, but it was also painful because I wondered to myself, after the past 5 years of all this work, why is this still happening? What I'm going to do is explain a bit on what albinism is. Then I will go into some human rights issues and that affect albinism generally, and then some that affect albinism specifically, and then the gender dimension. I will briefly tell you about what the international response has been, and then some ways forward to end on a hopeful note. Okay, so first slide. Okay, it's one of these fancy things. Okay, fine. I'm just gonna, there we go. Okay, so albinism is a relatively rare genetically inherited difference, and it happens in all countries of the world, in all ethnicities. It really is a lack of pigmentation in any or all of the hair, skin, and eyes. Almost every person with albinism is visually impaired. So I was gonna tell you all that you look good, but I figured that you're not gonna believe me when I get to the slide. The frequency of albinism really varies from country to country and from region to region. So in North America and in Europe, it used to be 1 in 17,000, but new studies are showing, interestingly, that it's actually much higher than that, but because they're more disguised among so-called Caucasian communities, there are studies showing Ireland 1 in 5,000 people with albinism, Netherlands 1 in 6,000, and the maximum is 1 in 17,000. In the Africa region, it's much higher, with 1 in 5,000 to 1 in 15,000, but many communities having 1 in 1,000 people. The term person with albinism is generally preferred to albino, but you have freedom of expression, but nonetheless, it's an excellent advocacy tool. Okay, so how it happens. Albinism happens when both parents carry the gene, And when both parents carry the gene, there's a 25% at each pregnancy that the child will have albinism. When normal pigmented children are born to parents who have the gene, then there's a 50% chance that the normally pigmented children carry the gene for albinism. This is an amazing image of albinism around the world. It may seem to you just like an aesthetic image, but it has done wonders at the grassroots level. When we go to communities and mothers who thought that they were the only one who had been cursed with a child with albinism see this image, and lots of tears have been shed on this image. So I think it's amazing. And in 2014, I had the chance to meet Pope Francis, and I got him to bless this image as a symbol of this work, and he did. Okay, so there are types of albinism, and one of the less common ones is the one affecting the eyes, known as ocular albinism. This is where sometimes, even in countries in Africa, you would see someone who's has normal pigmentation for an African, and then they will have blue or green eyes. This sometimes is a type of genetic mutation, or sometimes it's albinism. Or you could meet a Caucasian who looks normal, but they have visual impairment, which normally comes with albinism. Then the second type is the one that affects hair, skin, and eyes, known as oculocutaneous albinism, because it's ocular and cutaneous, eyes and skin. And this is the most common one. It's the type that Dorothy had, the type that I have, and it's the type that has people attacked the most. And of course, there are some types of albinism that are more syndromic. They come with health syndromes such as Hermansky-Pudlak syndrome, HPS, which tends to affect the lungs and other serious bowel complications. Here are albinism in Canada and Tanzania. On the left is a man with albinism and his brother, biological. And the man on the left, his son is here. It's Brady. Brady, put up your hand. Come on. Okay. So Brady's dad, Peter Ash, started an organization called Under the Same Sun, which is Canada-based and Surrey-based. It's the biggest NGO on this issue internationally, and it's only 20 minutes from us here. So if you're moved at all by today and want to support, I suggest you go to underthesamesun.com, and you can also talk to Brady. He goes here as well. On the right is a woman from Tanzania. So there are types of OCA, or oculocutaneous albinism. On the left, with Peter, he has OCA1, which is like really white hair, and this is the one you see in tropes in movies. But the one on the right, which is what I have, OCA2, happens in non-Caucasian populations, mostly. So here are the human rights issues. Low vision. Most people with albinism are considered legally blind in Canada. So usually we have 20/20 vision if you have a perfect vision. But if you have albinism, it's usually 20/200, which means what people can see clearly from 200 feet, you can see 20 feet away. So, for example, I take the bus, which is very interesting because I go on trips and people say, oh, look, the UN expert, and I go in limousines and I come home and I take the bus. So I really enjoy it. I really enjoy it actually, but anyways. Skin cancer, sorry, it's kind of graphic, but I have to show you this because I get these images almost at least 2 or 3 times a week on WhatsApp. People say, help us, this person is dying. I think at least one of these people is dead now from skin cancer. It's a huge epidemic, huge in the region, and it's curable. People just need sunscreen and some education about sun protection, what kind of outfits to wear. Like my mother eventually found out how to protect me in Nigeria because of a Scottish international student. So just one person changed my life, and that's the power of you being here today. So discrimination faced by persons with albinism, I tend to present it as being on a spectrum of the lighter one on one lighter end, and the more heavier end, and the middle. So this is on one end, is this issue about the portrayal of people with albinism. A lot of groups have had advocacy done on their behalf, and this is changing. But albinism is kind of slow, I guess, because we're few. And so you still see movies that, and music videos, Katy Perry, that still portray albinism as ghosts and extraterrestrial. But change is coming very slowly. I did see a couple of positive images recently. So on one end as well, there are names used by persons with albinism. Under the same sun, there's a catalog of these names, and a good majority of them were negative. I think the most striking for me was the one of ape or monkey. I just came from South Africa, and literally you open the Zulu English dictionary and look albino or albinism, and it says ape. And so it's very disturbing. It seems normal to these communities, and we got some resistance when we try to change it, but it adds to why these attacks are happening in the first place. It's like Rwanda. When you dehumanize, then you can attack. So in the middle of the spectrum is structural discrimination. When people with albinism are born, and some of them face infanticide at birth, if they survive infanticide and they go to school, there's always a problem of accommodation for their visual impairment. A lot of them don't get this accommodation, and a lot of them get, and now I'm talking mostly in developing countries, a lot of them don't get accommodation for their vision impairment to see the board, so they can't see the board, and they're being terribly bullied by teachers and students. When they're bullied, a lot of them drop out, or when they don't get accommodation, they drop out, and then they can't work because they're not educated. They end up in poverty. Some of them work in the sun, the peddlers on the street, or buskers begging, and there they get skin cancer. I should say that most studies show that without intervention, only 2% of people with albinism live in many African countries because of skin cancer. Only 2% live beyond the age of 40. And on the final end is, of course, more serious issues like infanticide, abandonment, and then physical attacks like Dorothy. And these attacks are happening because of belief in what we call witchcraft. It is not really hocus pocus, Harry Potter type of witchcraft. It's witchcraft that believes that the body parts of people with albinism can be used in potions to get wealth and good luck and win elections. So as a result, there have been many cases of attacks against people with albinism over the last decade. And not only attacks that kill them, but mostly attacks for harvesting body parts and leaving people mutilated. There's also ritual rape, because there's a belief that intercourse with a woman with albinism will cure HIV/AIDS. There are also grave robberies, like scores of grave robberies to get the body parts. And there's also trafficking in those body parts, because when there's demand and there's supply, you get a market. The Red Cross found out a few years ago that body parts on black markets go for thousands of US dollars, with a limb or an arm going for about 2,000 US dollars, and a full body going for about 75,000 US dollars. So you have to ask yourself, who is paying for this, and realize that it's probably an elite, because who has access to that kind of money, where annual GDP per capita is only 2,000 or 4,000. And that's why organizations like Under the Same Sun went to the United Nations, because there was some evidence that politicians themselves were involved. And so those who are supposed to protect are perpetrators. So you have to find new ways of doing things, and that's how the UN got involved. I'm going to show you some pictures of more people like Dorothy, and they're not extreme, because I didn't want to show you the extreme ones, but nonetheless, they're disturbing. So if you don't want to look, you don't have to, but I do show them out of honor to these victims, and to make sure that the advocacy continues around them. Okay, this is Pendo, who was attacked 6 years ago in August. And a few weeks later, Mungo was attacked as well. These people are losing their arms. As you can see, before 2014, there was total killing. It was quite rampant. And I noticed from about 2014, 2015, it became more mutilation. So it felt like people were responding to government action. Wherever government acted, they shifted from outright killing to mutilation, because this way it's less of a murder, it's less of a crime when they cut off body parts. Okay, and of course this is 3 months ago with Dorothy. Yeah, there was one really gruesome one that I think is no longer here, so that's okay. It's better you don't see it. Okay, so yeah, there has been over 700 attacks to date across 29 countries, but I must warn you that this seems like little, but if you think about it, this is a very small minority group, and in a village of 3 people, when one of them is attacked, you're talking about 30% of the population, and then when 2 are attacked, you're talking about the majority in that village, and that's how they are. They're sprinkled across villages, so this proportionality has to be taken into account to understand the gravity of these actions. Moreover, aside from Under the Same Sun, there's very few organizations that are monitoring, and so you have to factor that. You also have to factor the fact that most of the perpetrators are known to the victims. Family members have been turning in their own siblings because it's a chance to make money. But I must admit there have been a lot of stepfathers and less mothers involved in this kind of crimes. But there has also been co-workers, cousins, so-called boyfriends and girlfriends. The most difficult part of these cases is the fact that witchcraft is involved, and witchcraft tends to happen in silence and with a code of silence and secrecy. So it's very difficult for investigations to happen when people are scared of reporting and people are scared of reprisals from so-called witch doctors. Here is a list that I have from a mixture of sources, mostly from Under the Same Sun and also my own field studies going to the countries themselves. So this makes up over 700 cases. I can tell you that the countries with the highest numbers, Tanzania has an office there that monitors attacks. Next highest, Malawi has an active civil society that monitors attack. So there's a correlation between the numbers and having like an entity there monitoring the attacks. Okay, I don't have a lot of time left, so I will speed through. So some of the trends that have come out of these attacks include refugees with albinism who are fleeing, and you'll be proud to know that there's actually people in Vancouver who have received asylum from Canada. Not me, but there are other people in Vancouver in the last 5 years, and also in Montreal. Other countries have received them, like France and Israel, UK. There are also people who are internally displaced in their own country, who are looking for asylum or some kind of protection and refuse to go home. The attacks, of course, are gendered, with almost half of them victims women and 2/3 children. So very quickly, mothers of children with albinism in particular, what are their human rights issues? Abandonment by their spouse, because the spouse believes that they have cheated. They're culturally isolated. They're often expelled from the community because the child is considered a curse. Sometimes they face reprisal when they report that maybe their husband cut off the hair of the child and tried to sell it or sold it, which happens very frequently. And all of these elements makes them vulnerable to attack. Oops. Well then, I will go to the international response. So far, there are ways that the international community have responded. Most of it is through the laws that exist, the international human rights law. Of course, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is very centered on non-discrimination principles. The UNHCR is the Refugee Convention, which considers people with albinism as a particular social group and allows them to come in on the basis of well-founded fear of persecution. There's also the CRPD, which is for persons with disabilities, given the visual impairment and arguably skin impairment. There is also the Children's Convention, because the majority of the victims are children. Economic, social, and cultural rights, right to health, and then third, racial discrimination. This one is interesting. So the CERD has a committee that has concluded that albinism falls under their convention because racial discrimination is not linked to race alone, but linked to discrimination on the basis of color, and this basis can be separated from race. Also, this principle of multiple and intersecting discrimination, which has been promoted by the Women's Convention, says that a woman, most especially, experiences multiple and intersecting discrimination, but this principle can be applied outside of the gender context as well. And lastly, harmful practices is a growing body of work in human rights, which witchcraft-related attacks apply. So some international responses that have been really good include resolutions that have been drawn up by the UN, and also they made International Albinism Day on June 13. The African Union has done the same resolutions, and now they have created a AU envoy. So somebody of my kind of position will start to promote protection from this year, hopefully. So here are some of the highlights from this mandate, because I think sometimes people are cynical about the UN, like what can it do? And I think there are some parts of the UN that could be successful. And what I have been doing since 2015 is, I should clarify first of all that what I've been doing since 2015 has been supported mostly by funders that are not UN related. This position at the UN is not paid. It's a position of honor. The UN gives you one staff, and then you have to find resources. That's also why I'm connected to Trinity, because I had to find researchers to help out. But overall, there has been a lot of good success stories. So for example, the Regional Action Plan of Africa, which I helped to develop, and now it has been adopted by the African Union. They will also appoint an envoy. Also, harmful practices related to witchcraft and ritual attacks is now on the radar of the UN, and I'm pushing for a resolution next month. We have research teams like the one here at Trinity. I've done 7 country visits, which are very intense. They pay for 2 per year, so I've done 7. There's been law reforms. Several laws have been updated. For example, in Malawi, before, if you're found with an arm, you were charged under the Anatomy Act, because the criminal law didn't contemplate anyone possessing body parts like that. So under the Anatomy Act, your fine was like, I think, equivalent of $25. So you would find the same people cutting off arms over and over again because they could pay $25. So the law in Malawi, after my mission there, was revised, and now you can see possession of body parts for witchcraft as a separate issue from the objective of the Anatomy Act. Also, there have been 19 reports about albinism you can find online, many capacity building events, lots of advocacy events, and even a report on albinism around the world outside of Africa. So finally, the way forward. I think there needs to be a lot of emphasis on more protection on the right to life and security. Even though Dorothy was the last case that happened, the last case that was reported was only 2 weeks ago, even though it happened to the lady a few years back. So we need to continue work on protection. We need to continue work on health, because this is an easy fix. We need to continue work on research, especially on particular issues such as women and children. And you can support organizations like Under the Same Sun, who also in turn support the Regional Action Plan in Africa. So that's it. Sorry for the very quick presentation. If you want to find more beautiful photos like this one, check out White Ebony. Is online, White Ebony, or in French, Blanc Ébène, and you'll see more fantastic photos from DRC. So looking forward to hearing from you, your questions and your comments. Thanks very much.
So first of all, thank you so much, IK, just for sharing your knowledge. Don't go away. Yes, sit down. Your insights about the complexities that persons with albinism have globally. I also appreciated the overview of the remarkable initiatives that are going on and what you've been able to highlight and accomplish with your mandate over these past 5 years. It truly is inspiring. Thank you very much. actually can take about 1 or 2 questions before I end up introducing our next speakers. So what I was hoping to see if there's anyone in the audience. Oh, Holly, are you loud enough or would you like the microphone?
Oh, I have a gift of projection. Can you hear me? Yeah. Oh. I was just wondering, in some of these communities, it seems like providing genetic information wouldn't be a useful mode of attack. Has anybody tried to develop counter narratives or counter stories, like on the narrative level, to try to persuade people that this is this violence is harmful or wrong? Or
Go ahead.
Yes, there's been a lot of initiatives. I would say it has actually worked in Tanzania because in the last 5 years there has been no killing. Yes, there's been no killing, but there's been grave robberies and attempted trafficking, attempted kidnapping, attempted mutilation. But no one has died, so this is a step ahead. And I think that's thanks to a lot of I know Under the Same Sun has gone into the communities and done tremendous work. There's another organization called Standing Voice, based in the UK, done tremendous work. So even the UN there. So it is a proof that community counter-narratives can work. However, a lot of people with albinism I spoke to there said they feel like it's always the calm before the storm. Like they're not completely comfortable because they feel like people have come to cut the grass but not taking out the root. And they feel like the moment we stop, it's going to sprout again. So that's why I'm going after witchcraft, which has been very interesting.
That was a great question. Thank you. We've got time for her. Oh yeah, another question, Eveline? Sure.
Thank you so much for coming in for the work that you're doing. I remember going to school in Kenya and playing with children with albinism, and we couldn't play with them because we didn't understand what it was. So I'm really touched to be here. One of my questions was, when you speak, do you give the African context of why they do this, so that people can understand that perhaps it's not rooted in evil? Like, how do you tell it in a way that's sensitive so that the people also understand the other side of the story?
Could you clarify who's the they? Like, how do I explain it to people with albinism and their family?
No, how do you explain when you do international talks to people who don't understand the African context?
Oh, I see.
How do you tell it so that it's also sensitive?
I see. Yeah. Okay, just to prevent Barb from walking back and forth, I'll just speak from here. Yeah, no, it's a very good question, and if I had more time, I usually do this in about 30 minutes, and it gives me more time to go into a little bit of a background, because I'm African too, and I don't want people to think, of course, the Africans have come again with their problems, which no doubt people are thinking, because the region has had a lot of difficulty for various reasons. So I do try to lay down the context a little bit and to highlight to people that this issue is like the drug trade. Yeah. So there's a few bad people who are linked in a cartel and are propagating this as a criminal activity. Most Africans are horrified. They're just like you and they're shocked. Yeah. So I challenge you to read, for example, cases about Dorothy from Zambia. Just go attack girl, albino, Zambia. You'll see her, and you'll see the comments by Africans, and they're all horrified. But I compare this to the drug trade because I went into the prisons in Malawi and Mozambique, and I spoke to inmates who are doing time for these crimes. And I asked them, why are you here? Who sent you? And they, look, I don't know. My friend told me to do it. And then I speak to the friend, who told you? He's like, this other guy. And then when I trace it back, it ends at some guy who picked up a phone call. And he was instructed on the phone and doesn't know the mastermind, which is what happens with people trading drugs, illicit drugs. So I would say I always try to mention that, and I'm sorry I forgot to do that. I assumed Canadians don't have prejudices against, but yeah, this is how I try to do that. Yeah.
and then we'll have you come back afterwards, okay? Thank you for those questions. Those were excellent. So now in the program, I'd like to introduce you to my research partner, Dr. Cheryl Kirkham, Professor and Dean of the Trinity Western School of Nursing and co-director with me with Center of Equity and Global Engagement, who will now provide an overview of the program of research that we've been doing over the past 4 years to support IK's mandate, as she spoke to. This will be followed by a presentation by one of our Masters of Science Nursing students, Emma Strobel, who has taken an arm of the larger project on mothering and albinism for her thesis research. As well, she is the research coordinator for the Albinism and Human Rights Research Project. So we'll start with Cheryl first, and this will then be followed by Emma. Thank you.
Thank you. We've been really looking forward to this evening, and IK, it's very special for us to have you here with us, and thank you so much. So in the next few minutes, I'll just speak briefly about some of the background to this study on mothering and albinism, and we'll introduce you to some of the team that we're working with. As Barb has said, that our work started in 2016 with this, and not really that we had been seeking out to do this kind of work on albinism. But when IK, when we first met her, it was persuasive for us that we might be able to contribute a little something to this cause. So we started shortly thereafter with this literature review on albinism, spiritual cultural practices, and implications for health and health services. And for the academics in the room, you'll understand or appreciate why we started first to say what's in the literature, what's the evidence, and where do we go forward from that. We get kind of geeky about that, but we can talk about that later. Don't worry, no, I'm not using my 6 minutes on that. From there, you can go to the next slide. From there, we engaged a process of consultation with researchers, policymakers, and civil society organizations who were active in the area of albinism and human rights. And what we wanted to do was generate a research agenda on this area of albinism, and really to come down to the priorities for research. So we did this first of all by doing yet another literature review using a kind of a different question, a different method. Then we did a Delphi survey, and then finally we took those findings to host a roundtable in Geneva, and this is us at the roundtable with researchers, advocates, and really policymakers from 11 countries, and had a very fruitful conversation there to really hone in what might be priorities for research. And at that roundtable, it was really recommended to us that we follow up then on this study on mothering and albinism, which Emma will tell us more about shortly. Next slide. So this next slide is our research team. So not to worry about reading all of those names, but what I want to emphasize with this is that we have researchers from 8 universities, 6 countries, and also partnering civil society organizations, including Under the Same Sun, which you've already heard about. So finally, just to wrap up, you might wonder, how do researchers contribute to address such complex human rights violations? What can we even do as researchers? What can researchers add? So along with that kind of academic output of publishing and adding to the evidence in the literature, what we really hope to do is shine a light on an issue and bring some public awareness to it through events like this. We were told when we were in Tanzania this last November, which Emma will talk to you about, we were told that when we came back with our research findings, it was like we put the puzzle pieces on the table with our research, but we also helped them see how the puzzle pieces fit together. We went back to Tanzania feeling probably pretty underqualified as researchers. What were we going to offer, in a sense, to an organization that was well established, to people who were living this in the day-to-day? And it was quite remarkable to hear that this was actually our focus, and that as researchers, we're not the ones to bring about social change, but that, in a sense, we facilitate a process that might enable social change. And also, another thing for researchers from the Global North, we often have access to resources in a different way, and that we leverage that. So where we have researchers from the Canadian universities with funding from the Canadian government, in essence, from SHRC, and then we invite people from the Global South onto our project, and so where they would have a hard time leveraging in their countries that amount of money that we can access from the Canadian context for funding. So all of this, of course, makes it very important for us to keep in mind that Global North, Global South power differential. We don't say that lightly to say that, guess what, we get to bring money in. It's more that we're facilitating and offering some resources that could advance the cause. And what we do then is so important is that we're working in partnership, in collaboration, engagement, that we are really just part of a process. We're not running the process, we're not owning the process, but trying to do this in a very participatory way. So I'm going to pass it on to Emma now, who's going to tell us more of the details of our study in Tanzania.
Thanks, Cheryl. So, I guess springing off of what IK and Cheryl said, last year I got to go to Tanzania twice, and so the things that we're talking about tonight really took everyday form for me as I got to talk to moms impacted by albinism, so both moms with albinism themselves as well as mothers who have children with albinism. So I thought I would share with you just a few excerpts or narratives from interviews and sharing circles. So for the academics, that were basically focus groups, but sharing circles, that Jane, who was our cultural liaison and interpreter, and I did together. The sharing circles were mainly from mamas groups that under the same sun, like IK was mentioning, and another, actually did mention Standing Voice as well. So the two of them support these mamas groups to basically as like a social and economic network for moms who are impacted by albinism. There's so few resources, and these mamas groups were identified as really the sole resource. So, and we were also told time and again that this was the first time that moms specifically were asked about their experience and about their lives. So just to begin, this is Glory's story, and her daughter was 6 months old at the time, and I think that's an important piece because it's very current. She just had her baby, so this is her story of delivery. I was received well in the hospital, and when it was time for labor, I went to the labor room. There were 2 of us delivering at the same time. I have the habit, she has 6 kids. I have the habit of once the baby comes out, I lift my head to see the baby. This time, when I was trying to lift my head, the nurse was like, "You go sleep." So you see, there were 2 of us in this delivery room. I delivered my baby first, but the nurse just told me to lie back. She said nothing else. She didn't even cut the baby's cord. Then this other woman who delivered after me, the nurse ran to her and cut the cord and placed the baby in the cot. After she took care of that one, she came back to me. She cut the cord, helped with the afterbirth stuff, but she looked very shocked, and she called another nurse saying, "Come and see this. What is this child? Like, which category do we even put the child?" And the other nurse said, "No, this one is an albino." So when they said albino, they asked for the clothes to dress my baby in. But they didn't even weigh her or take measurements. When I asked, they wanted me to lift her onto the scale. They didn't want to touch her. They told me to carry my child to the ward and find a bed. Normally, you don't carry your child, the nurse does. Resigned to what was happening, she carried her baby to the ward and says, "I didn't even ask anything from them anymore." Once in the ward, where most moms and babes are sharing beds, 2 to 3 to 1 hospital bed, the response from patients was similar to that of the nurses. I came and placed my baby on a bed. Once the other woman saw my baby, she quickly grabbed her child and went and squeezed in another bed and left us. So they left me in a bed alone. Nobody wanted to come to that bed. In the afternoon, when my mother-in-law came to see me in hospital and bring food, she was told at the gates of the hospital, "Your daughter-in-law gave birth to an albino." When she found us in the ward, she gave me the food, uncovered the baby, and said nothing. From day 1, my husband left. He's never, ever cared for this child from day 1. The next day I was discharged. I knew my daughter had albinism, but I didn't know what to do for her. Once I was home, people came just to stare at my daughter. Before long, the whole village knew. I felt so insecure. I had to tell the local leadership that I was feeling unsafe. We were a spectacle. The only support I have received is from the NGO, sunscreen and an umbrella. When I asked what kind of support was useful for mamas, most of the response was about these mamas groups and how much social economic support they were getting. They make beeswax wraps, candles, soaps, and they sell them. So these three different moms shared these ideas. I'm more grateful because of the support and the encouragement I get from this group, because of all the things I've been through. Every time I come to the group, I get encouraged and become more hopeful that I have a means to somehow meet the needs of my children and raise them better. Before the group, I had so much stress, pressure, and everything, and fear. But this connection we have and the things we do together keeps me moving. The things we've been doing as a group have earned us respect out there in our society, because this group is a classic example that if you empower us, we are capable. So from that point, I think IK was mentioning for women, the ostracism and the stigma that occurs after you deliver a child with albinism is massive. So to have a space to feel safe, to feel heard, and to feel like you are a productive member of the society. And then in response to my final interview question, which was, is there anything else that you want to share or think would be helpful for others to know? This mama, looking in the sharing circle at other women with albinism and moms of children with albinism, said, "You are our mothers, and we are your children. A collective approach is best because you can't support the mother and not the child. You can't support the child and not the mother. Do something collectively, like a mother and child network." Another participant. People need to understand that albinism is in all communities and that persons with albinism are human beings like any other human being. So stop discriminating against us on the basis that we are not human. I asked how this could be approached. Seminars, like we do seminars to sensitize them. This should be multi-sectoral, from family to teachers to doctors to nurses to everybody. Everybody needs this awareness. And finally, this last exchange at the very end of a sharing circle. A mama asked, "You will come back, right?" And I said, "Which month? They want to know." I said, "Oh, I don't know yet." She says, "You are most welcome. And when you come, you sleep. A whole week. You must stay here because we have a lot to tell you."
To introduce Dr. Robin Healy, who will serve as the Gender Studies Institute respondent to our panelists on current projects, and to our key speaker, I think, who's also a keynote speaker coming back up. Dr. Healy is the co-founder and co-director of the Gender Studies Institute and the coordinator of the new Gender Studies minor at TWU. She is also an internationally recognized and admired historian with expertise in gender, the Atlantic world, Quaker studies, war and peace, and Canadian history.
Thank you, Holly. Thank you, Barb, for the invitation, and to Cheryl as well. I have to say, I am here this evening with my History 600 class. That is the core history course in our Master of Arts in Interdisciplinary Humanities. And so after my response, we do have to slip out because we have to finish class. But I understand that there's going to be some wonderful discussion. I'm sorry that we cannot stay for it. I just want to thank everyone who organized this evening, Barb, Cheryl, Ikponwosa, and Emma, thank you for your contributions. What a wonderful time that we've had hearing about the work that is being done. So interestingly, as a historian, when this evening happened to coincide with my class, I thought, it's fascinating that the topic of this lecture aligns so closely with the book that my students were reading for class tonight. And the book that they read is Michel Trujillo's Silencing the Past, Power and the Production of History. Trujillo was a Haitian historian and spoke about the role that silences play and the power that we give to certain narratives. And certainly as I was listening to stories this evening, to the talks as they were shared, I was thinking about this. So I'm not going to, don't worry, I'm not going to start reading you a history text. I just want to read you something that Trujillo says. He says, in vernacular, no, that's the wrong pink flag, there we go, silences. Silences enter the process of historical production at 4 crucial moments. The moment of fact creation, the making of sources. The moment of fact assembly, the making of archives. The moment of fact retrieval, the making of narratives. And the moment of retrospective significance, the making of history in the final instance. And history is as much about the present as it is about the past. I think that we tend to think, oh, history, that's just what happened before and it doesn't matter. But it is incredibly powerful because we privilege certain narratives and we privilege certain stories. And we privilege the way we understand where we are now and the way where we are going to go by the way we tell these stories. And so I am so encouraged by this evening, and I hope each one of you who is here will take what you have learned as the things that IK shared with us about what is albinism. I'm sure a number of you learned a lot, even just about what albinism is, but what is albinism, what is its impact on communities and societies around the world, what role does the global north play in shaping the way that albinism figures in the global south. How do we all work together to make a world in which we reassess and redirect some of the power differentials that exist for us? So as I think back, Dr. Nelson's question about narratives, I think we have an opportunity, each of us here this evening, we have an opportunity to leave this place and to participate in counter-narratives that can change the way we live in this world and that we encourage others to live alongside us. So again, I'd like to thank our speakers, and I understand that there's going to be some very provocative discussion that's going to follow, so I wish you all well, and thank you.
What we had thought might be kind of interesting to do is pose a couple of provocative questions that you see up here on the screen, and have a little bit of dialogue around that. Our background when we have our nursing networking cafes is often that, it's a dialogue. We actually get to speak with one another. And so we wanted to actually incorporate that, even though you're kind of in a lecture style where often we move all the furniture around in our graduate collegium where we are. So we're going to kind of imagine that a little bit right now. So what we'd like you to do is partner up with someone. You can move down here and get Flavia. So partner up with someone and look at those questions. We'd like you for the next, what would we say? 5 to 10 minutes. Look at those questions and have a discussion, and then I'm going to bring you back and we'll hear some of the comments and maybe also look to, if you have any other questions, we're here as the panelists to respond to those as well. So, and I might think, do we want to move around a little bit as well? We might do that as well. So we've been right on time so far, so I will kind of watch the time here, and we'll go ahead and do that, and then I'll bring us back together in about 10 minutes or so. Okay? Oh, can you hear me? All right. Couldn't never bring you back a little bit here, and I just want to let you know I kind of got excited because some of these are my students back here, so we'll get going and talking about a lot of things. So, does anybody have any comments about the discussion they had that they'd like to share, or a question that you'd like to pose to any of us here? I've got the roving mic.
My name is Olga. I would like to ask a question. So I was very touched by the story of master program student, about this woman who had experienced in the hospital this kind of treatment. So my question is, when woman experienced this treatment, is it on the level of the village? Is this hospital was in the village, or it's in the level of the country? What rights this woman has to protect herself, her child, like according to Canada, like it's impossible in Canada, but yeah, can you comment on this, please?
So kind of how, as a nurse in Canada, the situation would be, a nurse wouldn't necessarily be able to respond that way? Is that kind of what you're also meaning towards the end?
My question, yeah.
But your main question being about these moms in Tanzania delivering babies in the village setting, is it society-wide? So if you remember the map of Tanzania that we had up, we did do, the fieldwork was split between Dar es Salaam as being very, very urban, and definitely the center for a lot of medical care, and one of the key cancer institutes is there, Ocean Road, so where a lot of access to albinism-specific care would be happening. But obviously moms are delivering babies all over the country, in their villages and in smaller communities. So Mwanza is the one up on Lake Victoria. And so the story that I was sharing was from there, so more of a rural area. And I would say from the stories that I heard with the mamas, there was a little bit of a difference with if you're delivering in a big city hospital in Dar es Salaam, the response might be less severe, but still could be there, because a lot of the nurses and physicians might not have ever delivered a child with albinism. So certainly the lack of access to health education, regardless of where you are. So moms leaving hospitals not knowing what albinism really is, that you need sunscreen, you need to keep their skin covered. But certainly in more of the rural areas, like a very obvious discrimination, like not wanting to touch the baby, or not wanting to touch mom if she has albinism herself. But I wonder if do you want to speak to that a little bit, or?
Unless, is it answered? If it's answered, that's fine. Yeah, just I'm wondering if this woman would be in a big city, so what rights would she have to talk about herself? What rights just people have in Tanzania?
Sure. So she has every human right you can imagine. So a lot of countries like Tanzania, the problem is implementation of the rights. And they will tell you oftentimes that the country has a lot of problems, and so certain human rights are devoted. So there's a lot of emphasis on, let's say, like right to life, and very little on right to health, you see. So I think all the rights are there. It's just the country has devalued some, mostly because they say they don't have funding. Sometimes they have funding and there's corruption. It's a very complex situation. That's all I can say here.
Yeah, oh, I'm so glad. Oh, did you want to stand up?
Right. you. Just good, speaking about that number one comment about human rights lens, and what IK just said now, that there are laws in the country that prevents people from doing what they do to people who are different from them. I will say that Africa is not just homogeneous, it's not just one block of a country and one rule governs all. Even my own country of Nigeria, the area where I had IK here was just an area where people, they don't care, they don't hardly did you hear about them killing or maiming a child with albinism. But there are other things they do, like not wanting to interact with them if they are in the marketplace, or their mates calling them names and different things. The only problem I had with her as she was speaking, she said she had a problem with her sight, and a friend in the class was doing some education course, and a friend from, I think it's Italy, her husband is Italian, she saw her and said, oh, buy sunblock for this child. I said, what is that? Because we are all black in Africa, nobody cares about sunblock. So she said she would buy some for me, that I shouldn't expose her in the sun. I didn't know anything. Nobody was taking care of it, of people having babies like that. The nurses, even after, when I saw her as a baby, I said, wow, how did I get a white child? Then, but I saw her hair coily and a bit ginger color. Then I said, okay, the nurse came and then told me that your child has albinism and that I shouldn't take her to the sun. That's all she said. So, and with that, and with my being a teacher, I helped. Let me not take all your time. I helped her. I brought a board like this into my home and taught her. And she was very smart. Within 3 years, she was learning all those things herself. So that what I'm trying to say.
Okay.
What I'm trying to say here is that the human rights thing is that is what you guys who work with United Nations should really emphasize it, because it might be in the city, as they told you, but the villages are very remote and nobody cares about them. So I think people should, the government should be encouraged to go more into the villages. It's usually in the very remote villages we get issues like that. And sorry, the second one, the lens, is the same thing. So, okay. Thank you.
Well, I can see where you got a lot of your courage and speaking abilities, and thank you very much. You may be the next one getting a mandate. Okay, I'm going to go back here, and then here, okay?
So I just had a question about, from your stories, Emma, you were describing, it sounded a lot like discrimination against people with albinism is pretty widespread and like a common cultural thing. So I was wondering how a person with albinism goes about starting a family. And you also mentioned earlier that rape was very common because of the whole HIV belief. So are a lot of pregnancies in women with albinism due to rape, or is it like easy to find a man who is okay with it? start a family with? Like, what's the dynamic there?
That's a really good question. So I think starting with women who have albinism themselves versus men who have albinism, there's some literature that suggests that just because of the way that gender is constructed in Tanzania and the systems of patriarchy at play, a man, whether with albinism or without, can much easier find a life partner. For women, the story appears to be much different, and that definitely came out in my research as well. So for a woman, I was told several times in Tanzania, like to be a mother is kind of the penultimate aim, role, yeah. So for girls with albinism, it's a concern and it's a worry. And I heard a number of stories from women with albinism who were led to believe that they were in a relationship, or a man started a relationship with them, and it seemed to be going in the trajectory of having a family together. And oftentimes by the time she would have a child, he would leave regardless and go to be with somebody who does not have albinism. And I mean, certainly, I'm sure that some of the stories were a result of rape, but yeah, I don't, and for sure in my research that didn't come out explicitly. I don't think that's something that is easy to capture in these contexts, but for sure the risk being there. And I think definitely a concern from mothers who have girls with albinism, who have daughters with albinism, of worrying about their safety in relationships, worrying about them finding a life partner who is with them for the right reasons. And yeah, does that answer that question? Yeah.
I might add to that, just as repositioning for the next question, we also had some lovely stories where a woman's partner, the father of a child with albinism, would have left immediately, but over time they repartnered with, so there were some stories we have where men who weren't the parents, the fathers of these children, who really stepped in and were fathers to the children. So, you know, it's like any context. There is variation in the story, but it's a case again where the gender is important, is that the women, in a sense, carry a disproportionate burden of the stigma. It's, you know, the child is blamed on them that there's a child with albinism, and they carry a disproportionate burden, as we heard, of the violence. So it's really important. I'm answering the second question, why a gender lens is important. So I think there's another question in the audience.
Yeah, I'll take you, Catherine, and then back to your table.
I'm going to sit down. This is a question to IK. So I have a colleague in Sierra Leone who is married to a lady, a person with albinism, and she is very passionate about, you know, sort of advocating for human rights for the people in Sierra Leone who got albinism. So how they want to basically fight for human rights in terms of promoting the government to recognize that albinism is a disability, so then they can get access to healthcare, because often the barriers to healthcare or access to healthcare is lack of money, because a lot of the person with albinism come from low socioeconomic, of all the reasons that you stated. What kind of role can UN play in helping them advance? Because it is a small group, it is a local group, and often being from the global south, you don't get enough clout because you haven't got global north partnership, especially in applying for funding. So how would you recommend to advance this sort of advocacy work?
Wow, that's $60,000 question. It's a big problem that we have in this issue, because the UN ultimately cannot go down to the grassroots, right? It could, but in a limited way. So we need advocates like your friend and his wife to do a lot of the legwork. The problem is a lot of albinism groups on the ground are volunteer driven. There are people who go to work and then at night they're doing the NGO work. It's very tough. And right now, as I said, there are over 200 albinism groups in sub-Saharan Africa. That's a lot, right? But some of them are more successful than others. And what I think, aside from the lack of funding, is them being quite creative about their approach. Even if they don't have money, they could write a letter to a member of parliament asking for this recognition. And if that doesn't work, then they can write to me, the mandate holder at the UN, saying, please, can you urge our government? And I have a tool in my toolbox called communications, it's not a special name, to a government saying, we heard that this is happening, I urge you as a mandate holder to make this happen, and then I can get other mandate holders to co-sign with me. There's a mandate holder on disability, mandate holder on health, mandate holder on right to development, so many, and I can get like 3 or 4 to co-sign, and then they take that back and push again. I meet the government in Geneva, I put pressure on the ambassador. So they just have to kind of plug into more human resources when they don't have money. So it comes to strategy. So 2 areas they need help is money, but also like advocacy strategy and capacity building. But it's possible. I can give my business card to you later if you want. Thanks.
Okay, hello. I'm coming to you from the communications department. Specifically, I'm in a women communication and leadership class, and we talk a lot about how disadvantaged groups and women in our class, we talk a lot about the workplace have to stick together. And so I was particularly touched by what you were sharing about the mamas groups. And I just was wondering, in villages where there's only one person with albinism, one woman, is there anyone that she can go to? Does she have support? And then, or do you know what I'm asking? Does that make sense? And with those groups of women and mamas groups, in what ways are they able to work together, and is there any change that they see in the stigma of their specific villages?
Very good questions. So, yeah, you raise a really fair point that especially if you are in a rural area where you're spread out by quite a few, like quite a large distance, you might not have anybody else in your village who has albinism. So a couple of thoughts. So in terms of safety and security, we heard a lot about local leadership. So somebody would be assigned as like the street leader, and if there was a concern, a safety concern, they actually have like instead of a 911 call, it's literally blowing a whistle, and so you're calling community members for help. And this is something that IK might be able to correct me or add on maybe, but historically, it was often neighbors and community members who wouldn't necessarily be a part of protecting the one person with albinism in their community. But even during my field work, there were instances where we went to go meet with somebody who had albinism, and the community was quite suspicious of us, worried that, what were our intentions? And so there's a bit more of a community response and a community protective layer, I guess. For the mamas groups, you're exactly right. They functioned as like the only space to connect as women, to connect as mothers, and to connect over this shared experience, a very unique shared experience of having children with albinism or being mothers themselves with albinism and experiencing the stigma discrimination that goes with that. Lost my train of thought on that one. Yeah, maybe
another example that we're anticipating, our project is next going to South Africa, and then after that in Ghana, but we already know that in South Africa there's another form of social support. We are not sure yet whether or not there will be mamas groups, but we know that there is a virtual WhatsApp group that mamas are on. And so I think that this is changing quite rapidly, the way that social media is changing in communities, so that there may be other unexpected ways of having social support by like women with similar experiences. So that's an example. We're hoping to tap into that WhatsApp group in South Africa to hear how that becomes a form of support for the mamas.
I was going to add to that is how that becomes quite empowering for these women. So when we looked at the data, and they are together and they're galvanizing this, this capital and looking after and surviving themselves. It really is quite courageous in the way they really have, there's this force of empowerment there that we can't overlook, that gives them that collectiveness that we see that in those mamas groups. So it's kind of a really positive, I think, outcome of that support they give to each other, one another. I'm looking at the time, and we can take one more question. Oh my goodness. Oh, should we? How many? We've got, okay, 2 more, because these are my students. And I'm going to take yours first.
Okay, I'm just curious about what was it like for you coming in as white women from a completely different culture into this totally different atmosphere? What was sort of their attitude towards you? What were some of the ways, more specifically, that you were able to connect with them and to come alongside them rather than I'm here to fix everything sort of thing?
I'm going to let Emma speak to most of that, but I think what I want to start with is that because we were working with an organization under the same sun that has the offices in Dar es Salaam and Mwanza where we were working, it really changed in the sense that we were there working alongside an organization that was already doing great things. So that was the first piece of it that I wanted to emphasize.
Such a good question, and I think that this is a tension that okay, I won't move it. I think that this is a tension that I hold approaching the work even now as I'm going through the data, but certainly while I was there and in preparation going.
Just push it in.
Oh, I'm pulling it.
Push it together.
Hold it, okay. So for me, I think having Jane Waithera, and if you can remember her name, Waithera, Google her. She is a force. She was our cultural liaison and interpreter that we brought onto the project on IK's recommendation. And she's a woman herself with albinism from Kenya. And she had met many of the women that were part of these mamas groups that we did most of our interviewing from. And I think lots of conversation with her and her having the trust of these women and me getting, spending the time to get to know Jane and building a trusting relationship with her, what were my intentions in being there, and I think I really felt how she bridged me as an outsider coming in, and I think honestly, like I definitely am still very much an outsider, and I feel like, and I think Barb and Cheryl would agree, like we hold these stories, they feel very sacred, and the responsibility to do them justice. They don't need a voice, they have their voice, it's just a platform. We get to be here at Trinity Western University sharing their stories that they so generously shared with us. And these mamas, I can't obviously do it word for word, but one of the moms said basically that she was agreeing to the interview because I don't want any other mother to go through what I've been through. And so I think those are the things that I hold with me as I carry on, but definitely recognizing those concerns of power and privilege, and trying to tend to those as much as possible.
I might just add to that. Yeah, we have to really acknowledge our positions in this type of research, and I think I've done this type of research in the past, and just some of the elements that you spoke about. It takes time to build trust. There's a lot of other things that go on when you're forming your partnerships and how you're going to go along with this work. But it's important to note that IK we were approached first, and then our team that Cheryl showed, we're made of a large team of other people that speak into the analysis of this data, which we would not do any other way because we just don't understand it. So important when you look at your teams and who's on it, people from the diaspora, people that are there, and then the time it takes. They often talk about doing what we call a feasibility study and looking who's on your team. And I think in the past there has been researchers, and you've probably heard about it and unethical research that has gone on, and we can no longer do that. And we would not actually do that at all, but work alongside. And we're often vetting things with UIK and other people on the team and really helping us ensure that the voices and the stories of these women that we've been so privileged to listen to, that it is in some ways accurate. You want to add something to that?
I just want to add, I didn't really explain like cultural liaison, how tacked on to being an interpreter. So Jane was helping me understand the context and the number of times where she would say, no, you're not getting it. And just how important that was, and still is exactly what Barb's saying.
Hi, IK, you had mentioned that oculocutaneous albinism is most prevalent in underdeveloped countries, and I was just wondering if you noticed a pattern as to why, and what the NGOs and local organizations are doing to help the common health concerns that come with albinism in rural communities. And if they're effective in that.
Yeah, these are all very good questions. I miss being on campus. It is true that some communities have a higher prevalence, and some of the data based on genetic analysis have shown that the mutation for albinism happened in Africa. Of course, everything happens in Africa. So I kind of rolled my eyes when I first saw that, but of course it's possible. It's the cradle of mankind. And indeed, allegedly, Dr. Murray Brilliant, that's his real name, is one of the top geneticists on albinism. He's American. And he said the mutation happened in Tanzania. And interestingly, more studies revealed that 1 in 19 Tanzanians carry the gene for albinism. So probably the founder's effect is one element as such that makes the prevalence higher. The other is consanguineous marriages, so people getting married to their cousins and other relatives tightens the gene pool. So even in Fiji, I was there, it's like 1 in 700 people had albinism, which is quite high. And people marry their cousins, and it's an island effect as well. So consanguinity, geographic locations such as islands, Panama, same thing, 1 in 125 in Panama, founder's effect. And so what are people doing about this? Like, people in Africa don't like to tell people not to procreate with someone else. The whole ontology of childbirth is seen in such a beautiful supernatural system that interfering with that too much usually comes with backlash. So NGOs have not focused so much on genetic analysis in the changing of narratives, but more on what to do once you have the child. And so NGOs like Standing Voice have done a lot of mobile skin clinics where they move the medical practitioners from place to place to address skin cancer or to prevent it, and remarkable results. Like, skin cancer in Tanzania has gone down about 60% in only 7 years among this population, and it doesn't take that much. If you think about all the money going into various groups, just give us 1/10 of that and we'll change the lives of people with albinism within a decade. So it's one of those causes that truly your support actually makes a whole lot of difference, and very little goes into waste. Under the same sun, same thing. They've been focusing on education, hundreds of children on scholarships, so that we have ambassadors when they're finished. So there's a lot to say. I invite you to check out, it's very hard to lead you to a UN website because it's like mining gold on the beach. Can't find anything there, but you can follow on Facebook at UN Albinism and Instagram, and you'll see some of the links to my report, and you'll find out so much more. So thanks for that good question.
Okay, I think that was an excellent way to end. I was going to have you have the last word, and you basically...
That was my last word.
Exactly. So, okay, we've got a little something for you. Nothing for the rest of us because we're together. Just to thank you so much for all the work that you're doing and working with us and putting up with us. We do really appreciate. It's honestly I look at you, Cheryl, and we just think it's remarkable, and Emma, that we can work alongside you and support your mandate, because I often say now, this is probably some of the most meaningful research I'll ever do in my career. I focus on global health education, and while education is very important, what you're doing, I feel, is just quite remarkable. So thank you. So at this time, I'd like to thank so much my colleagues from Gender Studies Institute, looking at you, Holly, and Robin is now gone, my co-director with the CG, the School of Nursing, and the Mothering and Albinism group for collaborating on this event this evening, and thank you for all coming. This was great. Thank you.